This is the Birth of a Mama podcast, where birth, and especially postpartum, matter. Welcome back to the Birth of a Mama podcast. Today, Emma, Kahle and I. Emma, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Natalie. Excited to chat with you today.
Yeah, so let's start by you just telling listeners a little bit about yourself. Who are you, and why do you do this work with fertility, stress, and minerals?
Yeah, so my name is Emma Kahle, and I am a fertility coach and functional hormone specialist. I think stress and fertility are very often talked about, but it's really important to bring in the mineral piece as well, because as we'll get into in this conversation, we'll see how those three things are just really intertwined. A little bit more on a personal note, minerals have been a really important piece of the puzzle for me in my fertility journey. This can look different for everyone, but just a little bit of my story was that I ended up in seeking health and wellness, going down some rabbit holes of really restrictive dieting. And so for me, it was really that experience with restrictive diets that ended up really taking a toll on my minerals. So kind of keying into that piece for me really helped to round out everything that I was doing to support my overall health, but also fertility health. So again, that can look different for different people, but I think having minerals as part of the conversation can be really helpful.
Yeah, and I think so many women have been there, been following some kind of a restrictive diet at some point in their life. So I think that makes it really relevant. So what is stress and how does it relate specifically to fertility?
So stress is kind of a buzzword, right? We hear it all over the place. We're constantly being told we need to reduce it somehow, some way. But it's talked about often for good reason, because there is a lot of research that shows how important or the impact that stress can have on overall health and, of course, fertility, menstrual health, since those are so tied to our overall health. I think it helps to kind of take it back to the basics and just start with, how do we even define stress? So the word stress itself, we can just think of it as your body's reaction to an external demand. So something is happening out in the world that is putting a demand on your body. Your system has to react to it. So that's a super broad definition, and I'm sure you can already think of a bunch of different things that could fall under that category. Just as like a little historical tidbit, it was actually Dr. Hans Selye, who is known as the sort of father of stress research, that even started to use this word in the first place. Before that, stress was sort of a word that was used in physics and talking about mechanical systems. And he was really the first one to sort of bring it into this biology and human health context. But it definitely has stuck, and now we hear about stress all the time, right? So stress is not inherently bad for the body. It's our body's natural ability to be dynamic and to react and respond to external circumstances. And this is a good thing, right? Like, this is how we have evolved and survived as humans. And an important piece of the stress piece is breaking it down into different stages. So this can kind of help us suss out sort of what could be called more of a healthy stress response, and then how that gets a little bit contorted in our modern day, where we have obviously so much going on. So we have three different stages of stress. The first is the acute stage, and this is where something is first coming up for us in our life, and our body is actively responding to it. So this is where we're in our fight or flight, sympathetic nervous system response. We are actively responding to what's happening. And so again, if we sort of think with an evolutionary lens, surviving as humans, if there was like a predator attack or something, we need to actively respond, have a bunch of like new signalings happen in our bodies so that we can deal with something that's happening. But then that predator goes away, the situation ends, and we're able to come back together, like have a meal, eat some food with our family, relax, the stressful thing is done. So that's sort of like ideally what would happen in a stress scenario. If the thing that is stressful is continuing to happen, it doesn't just go away, then our body is going to kind of move into a different state of how we're dealing with it. And we call this the next stage, the resistance stage. And so what's happening here is something's been going on long enough that our body's like, we can't keep responding at the same high level this whole time. So we're actually going to kind of adapt a little bit to what's going on. And so pull back our resources a little bit, kind of just like try and put it on the back burner if we can, because we have all these other things we have to respond to. So bringing it into like more of our modern day, if thinking about like maybe your alarm clock going off every day in the morning, this isn't like necessarily a bad thing, right? Like we have responsibilities in life. Maybe we have to get up every day at 6 a.m. So that alarm that goes off, it is going to be a little bit of a stressor on the body, but it's going off day after day after day. So our body's going to begin to adapt to that sort of thing. If we continue on that path, we might eventually get into the third stage of stress, which is the exhaustion stage. So this is basically like our body has just been responding. The stress has been put into the back burner, but we've been responding for so long that we're really starting to deplete our resources and how we're dealing with that. And that's why it's called the exhaustive stage. We're kind of exhausted. So yeah, this is sort of like the modern story of stress a lot of times, because we have all of these things like work deadlines or traffic or unnatural light exposure, these things that are happening on a really chronic basis. And we're often pushed into this exhausted stage of stress where we're just really depleted of resources. And without those resources, we're not able to prioritize all of the different functions of the body. And something like fertility health or menstrual health is kind of one of the first ones to be let go, because we're going to prioritize other like survival systems ahead of that.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point that you mentioned kind of early on, that, stress is not inherently bad, because I think it's become a really bad word, like don't be stressed, and how do you manage your stress and dealing with your stress. And stress is so important because we don't have too much of it, but actually no stress is also a bad thing. So stress is not inherently bad, and it's kind of this balancing act. And, you mentioned hormone balance and how that obviously plays a role with the fertility piece here. And I think it's also important to remember that it's not just sex hormones. Like there's so many hormones in our body, and they all kind of, play together, so to speak, and they dance together in the body. And so when some of them are off, then it can affect the others. And stress is kind of this, one of the players here that affects that dance. So can you give some maybe like specific examples of how stress is tied to fertility health? So if someone out there is, trying to have a baby, or, concerned about their fertility health and their stress, what are some specific examples that you could give them?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first example to think about has to do with cortisol. So we often we hear about cortisol as one of our stress hormones. So our body, when we are dealing with a stressor, no matter what stage of stress we're in, there's a number of different hormones that are going to be produced. And I like how you just referred to it all as a dance, right? These different hormones in our body, and they're all relating to each other and dancing together. I love that. So cortisol is one of the hormones that's going to be produced in response to a stressor. Again, just to like dial in on what you were just saying, it's not bad. We need it. We need it to do its job. But of course, when it gets out of balance, that's when we start to have problems. So if there's too much of it, or if it's chronically elevated, that's where we start to hear cortisol in sort of the bad light. But so one of the ways that cortisol is produced is by being converted from progesterone, which is one of our really important hormones for fertility and menstrual health. So when we have high levels of stress for a long time, our bodies may actually have a lower level of progesterone because we're moving resources towards cortisol production instead. And so progesterone, it's crucial for so many things, but just to name a few, healthy ovulation as well as healthy implantation. So it's really just a critical piece of the puzzle. And then it's not just progesterone that is part of this dance with cortisol. Cortisol also is going to impact many of our other hormones that help to regulate our cycle. So things like FSH and LH. These are all, again, part of that just intricate dance altogether. So yeah, that's kind of one, is like cortisol and the way that all the hormones balance. To give you a second example, we can look to the adrenals and adrenal function in our body. So chronic stress is really depleting to our adrenals because they are playing a role in that stress response, but also in our body's just overall hormone system. So people may have heard of what's called the HPA axis, or the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal, essentially communication system. These three important parts of the body that at any given time are all talking to each other and helping to coordinate this dance of the hormones. So when we have chronic stress, this communication system can start to break down. And so that's going to impact how our hormones are communicating or dancing throughout the body. So really, adrenal health is important to focus on when we're talking about both stress and fertility. And then a third example I'll give you too is on the topic of inflammation. And this connects back into the cortisol picture. Basically, we have a feedback loop in our bodies between cortisol and inflammation. When we have raised levels of cortisol for a chronic amount of time, this is eventually going to lead to more inflammation in the body. But then the body sees that inflammation, and that in itself is actually an additional stressor, to which the body starts to make more cortisol. So it's a little bit of kind of a vicious cycle, a feedback loop. As we have more stress, more cortisol, more inflammation leads back to more cortisol. And again, all these things are dancing together with all of our hormones. So that's going to impact our overall health and our fertility too.
So important. These are such great points. So can you touch on, a few common stressors, so things that people can notice or look out for in their day-to-day, maybe in relation to specifically someone trying to conceive, or maybe a postpartum mom might be facing, some of these stressors that you might be able to give examples of that they may not even be aware of?
Yeah, so that's a great point. There's a lot of stressors that we aren't aware of, right? I think, and I think we'll kind of get into this, the different sources of stress, but a lot of times we're really cued into like mental and emotional stress, like what's going on in my life that I'm actively responding to. But there are lots of other things that could still be impacting our body's stress response. So a few just kind of easy ones off the bat that people might even be able to relate to right away are blood sugar balance. That's a huge one in terms of what we're eating, how often we're eating, and how that's impacting our body's ability to balance blood sugar. Artificial light exposure. This is both throughout the day, but especially in the evening, like after the sun has set. What light are we being exposed to? And then the third one is just simply eating enough. So our bodies need a certain amount of fuel to run. And if we're not getting enough fuel into our bodies, that in and of itself can be a stress.
Yeah. So glad you mentioned that. That's something that I think I talk a lot about. I probably sound like a broken record about that sometimes. Eating enough, especially in the postpartum for moms. I know it can be really tempting to want to bounce back and lose the baby weight, but especially in postpartum and when you're trying to conceive, restriction it's not the time to be dieting and to be restricting. So yeah, eating enough is a really, really big one. So glad you mentioned that.
Yeah, it's so hard. it's so hard when we have all this messaging coming at us, right, from our culture. And so yeah, that's why it's awesome to have podcasts like yours where we can really kind of push back against that.
Exactly, exactly. It's so hard. You have to be constantly talking about it and, going against the grain, so to speak, because it is so, just inherent in our culture to get back to the body and the person that you were before you had a baby, or, just to be dieting all the time and to always be trying to shrink your body and weigh less. So those things are not conducive to fertility, and they're not helpful in the postpartum, especially the early postpartum, and especially if you're trying to, breastfeed and support lactation. So yeah, such a good point. We could have a whole podcast episode on restricting and, not eating enough and how that relates to these two populations. So let's dive into minerals a little bit more. What are minerals and how do they relate to stress and fertility?
So minerals are so key to this conversation because they are really the foundation of our resiliency to stress. I've talked a lot about having enough resources to deal with stress, and minerals are an important piece of that resource bucket. So in terms of what minerals are, I think we often have the phrase of vitamins and minerals, like these are our nutrients that we need. But what are they? They are building blocks. They are essentially, if we think back to like 10th grade chemistry and remember the periodic table, that's where we're going to see our minerals. So these minerals, they are what's running our body's energy system. They're often called the spark plugs that are needed for setting off thousands of reactions that run every system in our bodies. There's this phrase, minerals run enzymes and enzymes run hormones. So this is like a really nice way to think of the connection piece, like hormones kind of being at the end of the line. They're sort of more of a symptom of what's going on under the hood. And so if we have any kind of hormonal imbalance in our bodies, that's really a symptom rather than a root cause. And minerals can be a part of what that root cause might actually be. In general, there's all sorts of roles of minerals in the body, everything from transferring nutrients into and out of cells, nerve conduction, pH balance, and keeping our bodies in homeostasis, really just whole body function. On the stress side of things and how minerals relate to that, minerals play a huge role in our ability to respond resiliently to stress. So as we face stressors, our bodies are burning through our mineral stores. And if we can keep those stores going, we'll be able to deal with stressors more effectively, more efficiently. Specifically, if we want to think about fertility health and hormone balance, we can think about all the different body systems that are related to that. So ovaries, thyroid, adrenal, brains, liver, digestion, these all depend on minerals. And there's also a nice example to point to in terms of getting into like a little bit more specifics, would be looking at two minerals in particular, which are zinc and copper, and how those minerals relate to estrogen and progesterone. So when we talk about minerals, they're always working together in pairs, in ratios, in relationship. So zinc and copper are one of these pairs that are working together. And we also, if we think about our hormone balance and our menstrual health, we know that estrogen and progesterone also work together in various ways. And our cycle balance, menstrual health, depends on those two hormones being balanced. So yeah, a common thing that we tend to see is that estrogen becomes dominant over progesterone. And this can lead to a number of different things. A lot of times PMS symptoms can connect back to the estrogen progesterone picture, but also just like having a smooth cycle, heavy bleeding, painful periods. A lot of times these can have to do with the ratio of those two. So how this relates to the copper and zinc picture is that copper is very tightly related to estrogen. And when we have higher estrogen, this causes us to retain more copper, but at the same time, having more copper cues our body to make more estrogen. So we have another one of these cycles where they're just kind of amping each other up. And when we go back to our mineral ratio, zinc is what is actually keeping copper in balance. And so if copper and estrogen are playing this game of continuing to raise each other up, zinc can come in and help to keep copper in balance. What is also common that we see a lot is that zinc can be quite depleted based on things that we all have in our life. Again, the stress piece, but also if we consume coffee, alcohol, sugar, high carbohydrate diet, low stomach acid. These are all things that can lead to depleting zinc. So that's also like a very common depletion, which is just kind of like wrapped up in the whole story of how it's also can be common to have higher estrogen levels. So for some people, again, this can be very individual, but for some people, zinc can be an important part of keeping copper in check, and then keeping estrogen in check, which is then supportive to fertility. So the one just thing to say off the bat is that, again, we need to think of these minerals always together. We wouldn't necessarily jump to, say, a zinc supplement if we know that someone had high copper, high estrogen. We really always want to look at the whole picture together. How are all the minerals working in the body? And a lot of times that actually means first, we don't even touch zinc and copper. We actually want to look at other minerals that are going to then have downstream effects on the copper and zinc, as well as just hormone balance in a whole. So anyways, that was a little bit of a nitty-gritty example, but I think that gives you an idea of just this interplay between minerals and stress and fertility.
That is very helpful. I love having this specific example, and also it being one where estrogen can be dominant, or maybe, there can be higher levels than what is needed in the body, because at least for me and for other people, I think when you think of fertility, you think of estrogen as being really important and you need it, but you can have too much of something, that's good or that you need. So it's really a total balancing act here, and keeping everything really in that beautiful choreographed dance of how it should be happening. And it's just so fascinating. I find that there's so many things at play here, and it can feel really complicated and overwhelming. So how can we best support our bodies with minerals? Like, this might sound like a lot of information to somebody, or they're like, oh my God, I don't know even like how to begin with that. So, how can someone start to support their body with minerals?
Yeah. So as we've talked about, so we know that stress and minerals are intimately connected. And we've talked about it can be really hard to necessarily address the stress piece sometimes. So that is where minerals come in, is that they can really be supportive of us, even in times when it's just like, this is a stress on my plate, I have to deal with it. So when it comes to getting minerals into our bodies, we must get them from food and drink. So we cannot create them. That's why I call them like the building blocks. We have to get them into our bodies, and then they can work their magic. So when we're talking about minerals, there's sort of two categories that often get mentioned. The first is macro minerals, so sort of like macronutrients, but on the mineral side, these are the minerals that our body just needs the most of in terms of volume, quantity. And so these are going to be calcium, magnesium, sodium, and potassium. So those are like the four ones that we just really want to be focused in on, and that affect so many things in the body. And again, they're all working together, right? Not thinking of any of these four on their own. So those are our macro minerals. And then we also have micro minerals. So minerals that we don't need quite as much of in terms of quantity, but also have crucial roles in the body. And we absolutely do need them, just in smaller amounts. So in terms of making sure we're getting these minerals in what we're eating matters, right? And this is a little bit of a side note, tangent, but I think it's really worth mentioning that it's not only what we're eating, but it's how what we're eating was produced or grown, because you have the phrase like, you are what you eat, but really you are what your food eats. Or you are, the food is only going to have as much nutrition and minerals in it as the soil it was grown in. Or if we're thinking about animal products, those animals were grazing on grass. Well, what was the soil that grass was growing in? And this is really important to talk about because in today's world, our modern farming practices have actually destroyed a lot of soil health. So the food that we're eating today is actually lower in nutrients and specifically minerals than it has been in the past. And this is true even like for non-processed foods. Like if we're talking about a carrot, the carrot that we eat today is actually less nutrient dense than a carrot that our grandparents would have eaten. This isn't like a totally lost cause. There are farming practices that do create healthier soil, which then leads to more nutritious foods. So these are, if you're looking out for products that mention things like regenerative agriculture or no-till farming practices, these are just a few examples of things you can look for. And it's not to say that like we need to be perfect by every means and like every food you ever eat has to be like grown in the perfect way. But even if there's just a few foods that we can include from time to time that have like this higher nutrient density, that definitely will go a long way in helping us to make sure that we are fulfilling our mineral needs.
Yeah, so I'm kind of thinking of it in this way that might help some people kind of like wrap their head around minerals and stress. So I feel like minerals are like, your emergency fund in your bank account, and you have, this finite number of cash or minerals in there, right? For an emergency. The emergency in this analogy is a stressful thing happening to you. It could be simple stressful things happening over and over in your day to day, or one big stressful event, or whatever it is. Your body needs that bank of minerals or that bank of cash to then fund the emergency or respond to the stressful event and get you back to this homeostasis. So like if that keeps being tapped into and you're not feeding it, you're not making deposits into your savings, right, into that emergency fund, then eventually it's going to run out. And then I think and correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but that's when we're getting into that exhausted stage of that stress response, and that's really going to be detrimental to somebody trying to conceive or somebody working on their fertility health, or even in the postpartum period when you're already depleted naturally because of having a baby and growing a baby and birthing a baby and lactating and all of these things. So I think maybe that will help kind of people understand how we're using the minerals. And then that's such a good point about the soil, and it made me think of like just having a simple garden in your backyard. Even if you live in an apartment, like getting a tiny planter box, and even if you can only grow like a couple of herbs and a vegetable, like it's better than nothing. I feel like, again, back to the analogy, like putting a little bit of money in all the time is better than putting less money in or no money in. So all the little things that we can do can really add up, or at least that's how what I'm getting from it. And again, correct me if I'm like misinterpreting this at all.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect example, thinking of it like deposits in a bank and withdrawing from our cash supplies. And yeah, whenever we can just add a little bit here and there, that's going to make a difference in the long run. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I love that you have the food first approach. I'm the same way with my practice. Is like, getting vitamins and minerals and all those things repleted in the postpartum period through your food is obviously going to be the best way, because things work synergistically and nature knows that. Like, she is the perfect example of how all of these things work together, even in ways that we don't even fully understand yet as humans, that we can't really prove with research yet. So getting it from whole food sources grown in healthy soil as much as possible. Obviously, like you said, Emma, that's not always going to be possible. And it can even be somewhat of a stressor to worry about like eating so perfect and making sure that your food is grown regeneratively or in this biodynamic way, or now you have to go start growing a garden. Otherwise you're not going to have enough minerals and you're never going to conceive. Not what we're saying, but just like any little thing you can do will be helpful. Even just eating more conventional produce is going to be better than like not eating produce, or, you know, eating conventionally grown meat is going to be better than like not eating meat. At least that's my perspective on it for people who are like, well, I can't afford the grass-fed version, or I can't, you know, afford organic, or I just gardening and starting a garden is not feasible for me. I just think like any little thing that you can do to make a change for the better or the positive with your nutrition, with these minerals, is going to be, you know, better than not doing anything.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I love what you're saying about when we're going to these whole foods for getting these nutrients into our bodies. That actually connects really well to the example we just talked about with zinc and copper. A great whole food source of zinc is different shellfish, and particularly oysters. Oysters are like a great source of zinc. But what else do oysters naturally have? They also are a great source of copper. So it's like nature's perfect little package. Instead of taking a supplement where you're just getting zinc in an isolated form, you're getting the exact right ratio of zinc and copper perfectly packaged for you by nature.
Yeah, I love it. It's there's so many cool examples of foods like that. Like another one that I love sharing is another seafood example, actually, and it's just basically fish in general. But you know, we worry about, at least in the like pregnancy space, right? You don't want to get exposure to mercury really any point in our life, but especially when we're trying to conceive or we're pregnant, and fish often have mercury. So, but they also naturally have selenium, and the selenium actually kind of essentially blocks us from absorbing the mercury found in the fish. And then there's also other great minerals naturally found in fish too, like iodine and zinc, like you're saying, and copper. So yeah, just Mother Nature, she is amazing, and she knows exactly what our bodies need and in what ratio. So as much as we can get these things from whole foods and not, you know, directly from supplements as like the first line of defense, is going to be the best thing, because of how these things work together just naturally. So cool. So if we move back over to kind of, you know, we've just been talking about minerals and nutrition. If we move back over to the stress side of things, so we kind of know what we can do in terms of our food and making sure we're increasing the mineral bank account, right? By getting more of those whole foods, getting more of those foods grown in, you know, more healthy soil, trying to grow food on our own if we can, those types of things. Is there anything we could do on the stress side? So like any examples that you have that, you know, someone could do to just manage the stress better or have a better response?
Yeah, so on the stress side of things, again, like not everything's always going to be in our control, but sort of thinking back to the bank account analogy, but maybe on the stress side of things, wherever we can reduce a little bit of stress, that's going to make a difference. So I think it's helpful to think about different sources of stress. So we've talked a little bit about this, but one type of source would be mental emotional stress. So things like deadlines, relationship conflicts, maybe a big change in your life. So a change in your job, moving to a new place, maybe some grief, like a death of a loved one. That can be a very stressful time. Or also just like general financial stress, right? These are things that we have going on in our life from time to time, and they're sort of like external things that are affecting what we have to deal with and grapple with on a day-to-day. So that's kind of one bucket. A second bucket would be physical factors. So we touched on a few of these earlier with blood sugar balance and light exposure and just eating enough calories. But these can also be other things that are going on in our body. So like our gut health, our liver health, our exercise. Are we exercising a lot? Are we maybe over exercising? That can be a big stress on the body. Are we under exercising? That could also be a stress on the body. What sort of things are we coming in contact to in terms of different potential toxins that are in our environment? Are we eating different inflammatory foods that maybe we're sensitive to? So there could be one food that for one person it's a stressor, but for another person it's not a stressor. Also just illness or injury, right? If we're sick, that's something that our body is actively responding to. It's a demand on our body. How well are we sleeping? And then also, you mentioned this earlier, but are we pregnant or postpartum, right? Those are really stressful times on our body in terms of their big demands, right? They're times when our body is having to put forth a lot of resources. So yeah, that's sort of the physical bucket. And then the third bucket, which I like to bring in, which I don't hear a lot of people talk about, is what I call spiritual factors. And the word spiritual can be interpreted in many different ways by different people. But when I say spiritual factors or sources of stress, what I'm thinking about are things like our personal sense of identity or sense of self-worth. Like, how do we relate to ourselves and see ourselves interacting with the world around us? Also, like, really big questions, like meaning of life type questions, and do we see ourselves as part of something bigger? Which for some people, maybe that's sort of a concept of God. For other people, that might be just a relationship with the universe, or maybe even just a relationship with our own subconscious selves. So there's lots of different ways that people can interpret this stress bucket, the spiritual bucket. But I think it's really important because a lot of times these sort of big questions are kind of underlying our narratives and just our day-to-day. So to make this a little bit more concrete, I'll give just a personal example here. Something that I've really been working on in the last few years is my own relationship with, do I feel like I belong? Do I feel accepted in a given situation or by certain people? And this is not like anything super special, I don't think. I mean, this is, again, thinking back to like how our brains are wired, in terms of how we've evolved, thinking to like being part of a tribe, and you need to be accepted by your tribe around you. You need to have this sense of belonging, because if you're kicked out of your tribe, like that's going to make it a lot harder for you to survive on your own. So in terms of why our brains are wired this way, it makes a lot of sense. But then putting that into our modern context of like, if I go to the grocery store today and have an interaction with the cashier and like don't feel a total sense of acceptance by that person, like, is that really going to impact my true safety in the world? Probably not. Probably never going to see that person again. So I've definitely felt a big shift just in myself as I've been doing some of this personal work about creating a little bit more spaciousness with how I'm feeling in terms of my sense of belonging, and really cultivating a little bit more sense of just internal safety. That's really allowed me to just like bring down the volume on that narrative in my mind that, honestly, it's like if we go back to stress as being a demand on the body, if there's something that I'm thinking about, even if it's like in the back of my mind, every time I interact with another person, like that is definitely a stressor. So some of these questions are like pretty big. We're probably not going to have an answer today or tomorrow. Like, might even be a lifelong journey of kind of reconciling these things. But I think it's good to just keep in the picture that stress can be coming from mental, emotional, physical, or spiritual factors. And really wherever we can make a little adjustment, that'll help make us more resilient to some of the stressors that we really don't have any control over and are really gonna just keep happening. One kind of common mistake that I like to point out here is I see a lot of people talk about, adding a 10-minute mindfulness practice or 30 minutes of yoga. And those types of activities can be great and can be super helpful in terms of helping people to get centered, become more calm, kind of tap into that parasympathetic state. So if you are someone who resonates with any of those practices, that's awesome. Like, you don't need to stop. But the mistake comes when we add something like that into our routine, but then we continue living the rest of our day just the same, with the same like go, go, go mentality, all of the same physical, mental, emotional, spiritual factors that are causing demands on our body the rest of the time. So I just think it's really important to point out that rather than adding something new to our daily routine, sometimes it can just look like taking some things out, where possible. At the end of the day, we have responsibilities that we have and we need to be able to attend to them. But wherever we can find space, maybe it's even just a moment to slow down, but maybe it's hopefully like a moment throughout the day, right? Like we can find 10 different times to like take a breath. That can go really far in terms of, thinking about just how can I overall find small ways to reduce that stress burden.
100%. So good. I'm making all these connections to kind of what I preach to mamas and how I help people get prepared for postpartum. And one of the things is, making sure that you can delegate some things. So that's what keeps popping up for me is like, how can you get rid of some stuff? How can you take some stuff off of your plate? Of course, some of the things you're going to have to do. If I use the example of postpartum, if you're breastfeeding your baby, you're the only one who can do that. But you maybe can delegate cleaning the house to your partner, or hiring someone to do that, or having a friend or a family member come over and help with something like that. So like little things like that, that if that's a big stressor to you, or the effort that it takes to carry out that task is too much because you have so many other responsibilities that take priority over that one thing, but that one thing is still important. If you can delegate it, that can help immensely. And like you said, also just finding even just a minute of time, but multiple times throughout the day to take a break and check in with yourself and do a simple breathing practice. There's like box breathing where you breathe in for 4 and you hold for 4, you breathe out for 4 and you hold for 4, and you kind of do it in a box. There's tons of different quick breathing techniques that you can do. But I love that you point that out, because I think that's a big one, is people just think like, okay, I have this stressful lifestyle. I just need to be more mindful. I just need to like meditate for 5 minutes a day or something. And like, that'll cover all my bases and I'll be, way more resilient to stress. And maybe a little bit, depending on how consistent you are with that and how much you're actually, like sticking to it. But I think that having these smaller pieces that you can put in throughout, and then also being able to just get rid of some of the stuff that is just, it's not as important, is really the best way of going about it, and also the most sustainable, especially for those in postpartum. But also if you're trying to conceive, there's so many things that can be like quote unquote outsourced, and you don't always have to pay for it. You can just kind of recruit help from your partner, from a friend, from your mom, like literally anybody that is willing to help.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's so many different creative ways that we can go about thinking, just like, okay, how can I take a little bit off the plate? And I will say too, just for the record, like the 10 minutes a day of meditation, mindfulness, like that was me for sure. I definitely did that. And I was like, I'm doing it. But it wasn't really making, a true impactful difference on how I was living my life. So just want to say, if there's anyone out there who's like, wait, I do that. Like that was me as well. So I get it.
Yeah, no, it's such a good point. Like, I think it's almost more valuable to just see how you can be more present in your actual like day-to-day life, right? Instead of saving it all up for the end of the night or whatever, or maybe the first, few minutes of your morning or something where you just sit for 5 or 10 minutes and do something, but really just making it more of a focus of throughout your day. How can you break it up and come back to yourself? And I loved the spiritual piece that you talk about, because I think a lot of times, at least in my own mind, I group that like personal experience with acceptance and belonging into the mental and emotional, but it's totally is a spiritual thing. And so many of those like bigger questions and bigger thought patterns kind of can come in there, like your identity and your self-worth. So it's truly, this is like a holistic perspective, which is something that I, do in my practice as well. So I love bringing that piece in and, underlining the importance of that as well in all of this. So good. So can everybody out there that's, trying to conceive, like every woman that wants to have a baby, benefit from including more minerals in her diet? And, do they need to be testing these things? Are there tests for that to learn if they need to have certain minerals increased in their diet, or even maybe if a supplement is warranted?
Yeah. So to the first question, yes, in general, including mineral-rich foods in your diet is a great place to start for just about everyone. I was just reading, going back to a national survey that went out between 2007 and 2010, and they were looking at, okay, are people in the US actually meeting their daily requirements for a whole bunch of different nutrients, vitamins and minerals, and other cofactors as well. And, you know, they were using pretty conservative standards for like what is enough of a given mineral. And even with those conservative standards, they still found that the vast majority of people were lacking in nutrients. Just about everyone out there can use some mineral support. And of course, that's going to look different for different people of exactly what they're needing, which gets into the testing piece. But yes, minerals can be so supportive. And in terms of like an easy place to start for people, I often talk just about salt. Salt is a great place to start because we all know about it, right? I have salt right here on the table next to me. So it's accessible. And then also, again, we're kind of pushing back against a little bit of outdated recommendations that we've been told for so long that are not evidence-based, that we need to be reducing or limiting our salt intake. So yeah, salt is a great one. In terms of fertility in particular, research has shown that women who are not getting enough salt, so this is basically less than 1,500 milligrams per day, are likely to have lower progesterone levels, 37 lower progesterone levels, and they're also at a greater risk of anovulation, 2.7 times greater risk of not ovulating. So that's just like really specific how salt relates to fertility health in particular. So a great place to start with this is just salting your food to taste, maybe experimenting with a tiny bit more salt. You can just see how your body responds. An important thing to note with salt is very powerful and your body will respond to it as such. So really go slow with this process and see how you're feeling. If you're feeling really energized, that is a good sign that you're responding well. But if you're feeling more tired, sluggish, also if you're feeling bloated at all, that could be a sign from your body that you need to slow down. And you may need to focus on potassium at the same time because, again, all of our minerals work together, right? And so sodium and potassium are one of those important pairs. So that's another thing to keep in mind. So salt can be a great place to start experimenting if you're someone who does like to just kind of try a little something and see how you respond. But if you are someone who likes to have a little bit more data, or if you're just curious, like what are the individual minerals that would be important for you, that could be a reason why you might look into testing.
Yes. So we're going to get into testing in just a minute, but I actually want to circle back to salt because I think this is such an interesting topic. And, you know, I'm a dietitian who was conventionally trained, and obviously limiting salt is like a big thing we tell people to do, right? Like 2,300 milligrams, like that's the UL, the upper limit, meaning if you go over that, we don't, you will become unhealthy at that point essentially. But I was just reading, and I'll see if I can get the study back, did it or anything, but I was reading the summary of the study and they were looking at people's diets, like where if you have too little sodium, it's not good, obviously, like you need a base level amount. And then if you have this like middle ground level of sodium, it's really like we see that these people are the healthiest. And of course, this is not causation, this is correlation, but it's very interesting to note. And that range was higher than what we're saying. We're saying like 1,500 to 2,300 milligrams is what people should be consuming per day. And this study was showing that actually the 3 grams, so 3,000 milligram to 5,000 milligram, so 3 to 5 grams of sodium, which is, I mean, the lower end of that 3,000 is well over the upper limit, right, of that we're giving sodium. These people were the healthiest. They had the healthiest the least amount of disease. And then, of course, if you go really, really high, you also see like not so good stuff, like over 6,000. But that's a lot that's almost triple what we're saying is the upper limit here. So I just think this is interesting to know. I'm not telling anyone to go out and start, pouring salt onto their food. And it's also important to take kind of note of your dietary patterns. Like if you eat a lot of fast food, if you eat a lot of frozen food, if you go out to eat at restaurants a lot, you're already going to probably be getting a lot of sodium in your diet from those foods inherently. But if you're someone who's very health conscious, you cook a lot at home, you use whole foods already in your diet, do not be afraid to add salt to things. Like, in fact, like Emma's saying, and I am encouraging as well, to add salt to your food, especially to taste. Salt makes food taste good as well. So don't be afraid to do that. And especially if you're someone who's been restricting and you're trying to kind of get out of that restrictive pattern and adding more whole foods into your diet, salt your food. It tastes delicious. And what we're finding is that you actually need maybe a little bit more than what we've been saying all these years, especially in conventional dietetic world. So I just want to make note of that. And with that being said, I do want to talk about testing. So how do you like to test for minerals?
So for testing, blood work is definitely the most common, but I prefer to use hair tissue mineral analysis, or HTMA. And this is testing the mineral levels that are actually present in a sample of your hair. So we actually have much greater volume of minerals that are stored in tissue. So hair is a tissue rather than in our blood. And when it comes to the blood, our body wants to maintain balance in our blood. And so our body will actually take minerals out of our tissues in order to keep our blood levels in balance. So if we are sort of trending toward imbalance in some of our minerals, that's actually going to be detectable much earlier in a tissue sample like hair than it would be in a blood sample. Another thing too, just comparing the two of those, blood work is a snapshot in time from a single moment, and of course, things can fluctuate a little bit. HTMA hair samples, they look at an average of about 3 months of time in a single sample. So just a little bit more information about how your body is on average rather than like in a certain single moment. So yeah, HTMA results can show us patterns in the body and can give us some insight into how we might support that. So it's not just as simple as like one for one, your mineral came back showing low on your hair sample and therefore we need to supplement that. It's a little bit more nuanced, right? We're looking at patterns. All minerals are working together. They're working in relationship. So we really want to be looking at this bigger picture. And, there's no one perfect lab test, but I do like HTMA because it's affordable. It's not invasive, so you don't have to go into a lab and get pricked. You can just cut a little sample of hair at home and send it into the lab. And it's also, in terms of the testing and the equipment, it's super accurate and reliable. So for someone who's maybe just starting to try to conceive, this could be a great place to start to get some insight into what mineral nutrition pieces they might need to really focus on. For someone who's maybe been trying to conceive for a while but is having challenges, the mineral piece could give some clues about how they might address the root cause of what's going on for them. And then, of course, like we've talked about, the postpartum period, we can be very depleted because we've just created a human, right? And perhaps we're continuing maybe to breastfeed that human. So this can be a great test to for in the postpartum period to help understand how to support the ongoing needs and how to replenish after pregnancy, especially if someone is thinking down the line that they might want to conceive again, to be able to go into that next pregnancy knowing that they have all of their mineral levels back where they want them to be. That can be, really useful piece of information. So in general, HTMA can be a great starting place for all those reasons if you're someone who wants to dive a little bit deeper.
Yeah, I love it. And actually, I am doing this HTMA with you, and I'm super excited to get my results back and have you go over them with me, because I'm kind of sort of in both worlds. So I guess this is kind of like a spoiler alert, but I'm obviously postpartum. My daughter just recently turned 2. And I know to some that might sound like I'm way far off, like out of just having had a baby, but it can take a few years for some people to get quote unquote depleted depending on your diet quality and your stress, as we've been talking about this whole episode. So from that perspective, I'm curious to see where my levels are at. And then also we're considering having a second baby. So I'm kind of in the both worlds right now, the postpartum-ish world, and then also the possible, like looking at my fertility world. So I could do, but I love this. I love the HTMA. I'm so excited to actually go through the process and see what my levels look like. So, for anyone listening who's like, this sounds interesting to me, I'm curious, I'm trying to conceive, or maybe I'm postpartum, what would be the next steps for that person to, work with their minerals and dive more into the mineral and stress world?
Yeah, totally. Well, I think we've given a lot of sort of action items throughout. So, on the mineral side, we talked about maybe experimenting with a little bit of salt, just because that's such an accessible thing to look at. And especially, knowing just how important that is. And maybe the recommendations we've been given aren't necessarily where the science is at now. We also talked about food sourcing, if we're able to, even just here and there, incorporating foods into our diet that might be a little bit more nutrient dense. That also just goes to like eating whole foods in general, right? We talked about like Mother Nature packaging whole foods so well and like the perfect balance of all these nutrients. If people want to dive deeper into learning about some of the minerals more specifically, so we mentioned like our macro minerals, calcium, magnesium, sodium, potassium, but also some minerals that are more of the supporting minerals that are really important for fertility and preconception time. I've actually just created a new freebie guide for folks to really introduce these minerals on a deeper level and give you some more information about why they're so important for your body, as well as where to find them, what different foods are the best sources. And then also a little bit more information about the HTMA test if people are thinking that that might be a route they want to go down. And then, of course, if people are interested, if you know right away that your interest is piqued about an HTMA and you think that might be a good next step for you, that is something that I offer as just like a one-off test result consult. So if people are interested in that, they can definitely reach out.
Amazing. Your freebie sounds like such a wonderful resource. I hope people jump on that. So with that, if someone is interested in that HTMA with you, or they want to work with you, or just even connect with you, Emma, where can they find you? What platforms are you on?
Yeah, you can find me on Instagram, and I have a website as well. So feel free to send me a DM over on Instagram, or just head to my website and you can find my contact info there as well.
Perfect. And we will link all of that in the show notes. Emma, thank you so much for your time and coming on Birth of a Mama and talking with me today about all things fertility and stress and minerals. This has been so insightful, and I can't wait for people to listen to this episode. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you, Natalie. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Be sure to follow me on Instagram at the.moms.nutritionist and subscribe to this channel to be notified of each new episode. And if you'd like to support the podcast even further, please like this video and share it with a friend or anyone who could benefit from watching. This helps get the word out there, which helps moms heal and thrive.